Hi there. Good morning. Yeah.
Take care of that.
A good Thursday morning to you on this June 10th. In just a second, we'll get into subject matter. Of course, we're gonna span a couple of different stories. We'll touch on some international stories today. We'll talk about politics at home. This show presented by the team at Bitcoin Well, as it is each and every day. Our title sponsor since episode 1. Adam O'Brien, the founder and CEO of Bitcoin Well, is going to be joining me today on the show, coming up in 90 minutes or so. Avik Roy will join him as well from Forbes. We're going to take a look at what's been going on in El Salvador. If you've been paying attention to international news, and especially on the currency front, El Salvador, I mean, the country's made Bitcoin an official currency. It's a big story. We're going to get into what it means. That's coming up in about an hour and a half from now.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jesperson.
Give you a sense of what's coming up on the show today. We'll talk to a health researcher, an expert, Dr. Angela Mashford-Pringle, coming up in about 30 minutes. We're going to continue our coverage of some of the stories that are not just coming out of Kamloops at this former Indian residential school, the discovery of these 215 bodies, but it's got people across this country talking about a myriad of different things, which is good, shining a light. These are difficult and uncomfortable conversations. If you know, I mean, Angela White joining us this week here on the show. If you caught that interview, I probably don't have to tell you how powerful it was. If you didn't catch it, you need to make time for it. Trust me, it's one of those must listens from the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. She joined us from the West Coast, and part of what she talked about, really disturbing. This is back on June 8th. If you're looking for the show, you can find it on our podcast archive or, of course, on our YouTube channel. Talking about dentists that would attend these residential schools and be paid per tooth for dental work, for extractions they did. And Angela said that's why you'll see so many residential school survivors these days with full dentures, because in many circumstances they were left, without teeth. I mean, she said it was absolutely appalling. My stomach just twisted when I heard that. I know that was the case with many of you as well, because you wrote into the show, you told us that. Before that, remember we had Dr. Bukla Salami that was on the show from the U of A's Faculty of Nursing. This was a while ago. I think it was like May 5th or something like that, first week of May. She came on. She talked about systemic racism in healthcare, specifically identifying marginalized communities, BIPOC communities, including Indigenous communities. So we're going to get into conversation about Indigenous health care. That's coming up around 9 o'clock. And then, as mentioned, 10 o'clock, international currency. Right now, we continue our conversation on violence in the Middle East, on Israel, on Palestine, on the viability of a two-state solution, on the political career of PM Benjamin Netanyahu. There are a lot of factors at play here, and we've been talking to a lot of different voices. It's my pleasure to welcome to the program this morning Adir Krafman from the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and my friend Stacey Leavitt-Wright from the Jewish Federation of Edmonton. Welcome to the program. Stacey, welcome back. It's good to have you both here this morning.
Thank you so much for inviting me back.
You bet. We're looking forward to a candid conversation here. Obviously, these can prove to be, Stacey, as you know, these can prove to be polarizing conversations. We've been talking to people who have very passionate perspectives from a number of different angles here. And some folks have taken issue with some of the conversations on this show, which is entirely their right to do. I've been eager to get you back on here. I'm looking forward to talking to you. I want to ask you very plainly, when it comes to dialogue around this conflict in the Middle East, I know you've taken issue with some of, for example, what you've heard on this show. Let's get into it. Let's talk about it. What's bothered you in particular, what you've heard right here on Real Talk?
What's bothered me is, excuse me, the language that's being used that is at times inflammatory, is incendiary, and does not speak to the nuances of the geopolitical situation, and has not allowed for facts on the ground and historical accuracies that we know of.
So what in particular, like let's really get into it. I know this is an audience that's willing to listen. This is an audience that's eager to learn. You've got a host that's here. I'm here for this. So let's get into it. Let's talk specifically.
Specifically, I think there has been a lack of understanding of the Jewish people as an ethno-cultural people, that we're not just a religious group, that we have a language and identity and deep ties to Israel. The words of colonialism and apartheid are being thrown around loosely on social media, and that is having a deep impact on the youth in our community. I'll leave it there.
Adir, do you see this? I mean, has this been, would you say, a common sentiment across the country that people are feeling unfairly characterized or inaccurately or even irresponsibly characterized?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, thanks for having me on the show. I'm really glad to join this conversation. I think when we look at different issues happening, not just in Canada, but in North America, we often put things through the prism of oppression or through the prism of whiteness and colonialism, when there is sort of a strong group and a weaker group. And what we fail to see that what's happening in the Middle East, not just between the Israelis and Palestinians, but many other ethnic conflicts in the region, is that there are multiple nations and multiple national groups who are in a conflict over a piece of territory. And so by describing the conflict, falsely describing the conflict as sort of a settler colonial initiative or an ethnic cleansing sort of racist endeavor, what folks are essentially doing is Jewish erasure. Because what they're saying is that Jews are European and they're white, they have no connection to the Middle East whatsoever, and nothing could be further from the truth. Jews, as we saw in previous centuries, were never accepted as Europeans. When even the most assimilated ones, the ones who showed no religious observance, were targeted. And what we have to, I think, get back to is that if we're going to have a productive conversation on the Middle East, we first need to acknowledge that the Jews have a deep connection to the land of Israel, as do the Palestinians. And the only way forward is a way to establish two states for two peoples so that everyone can live in peace, security, and dignity.
And this is where the conversation needs to be, isn't it? Which is how you find the solution. Is a solution possible? I'm never really a fan of conversations that would simply decree that a solution is not possible. And I have yet to meet somebody that said that they're just going to throw their hands in the air and walk away because they don't see it happening. We've had different opinions, and I'll ask you to take this over. We've had different opinions from people, though, on whether or not a two-state solution is viable, including a rabbi that joined us yesterday. Do you think that it is?
I absolutely think that it's viable, and we've seen it in history, right? So folks will say the expansion of settlement activity in the West Bank precludes a two-state solution. There are too many Jewish communities in the West Bank, and so on. But if you look back in history, the government of Israel has shown a willingness, whenever it deems that there's a partner for peace, to make painful compromises, including removing Jewish communities into different territories. So there were Jews that lived in the Sinai when Israel controlled the Sinai after its war with Egypt in 1967, and during the peace agreements with Egypt, those communities were uprooted and moved deeper into Israel. In 2005, again, Jewish communities were removed in order to make way for Palestinian autonomy. Sadly, rather than taking this opportunity to establish some form of healthy autonomy, the Palestinians leadership chose Hamas to lead them in the Gaza Strip, and we obviously see the consequences. It's recognized by Canada as a terrorist organization, and for the last 15 years has been holding Gazans hostage as it fires rockets on Israel. Israel has shown a willingness to make these kind of sacrifices for peace. What we haven't seen, though, is a willingness from the Palestinian side to accept history, to understand that there was a war in 1948. The Israelis call it the War of Independence. The Palestinians call it the catastrophe or the Nakba. And there hasn't yet been an acceptance that Israel is permanent. It's here to stay. Jews are a people that have a deep connection with the state of Israel and with the land of Israel, and have agreed to any form of agreement. The Palestinians rejected a partition plan in 1947. In 2000, there were many summits with different proposals led by, at the time, Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Even as recently as 2007, Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Olmert, I think, offered 100% of the Gaza Strip, and I think it was 98% of the West Bank, including some additional land transfers to account for the large settlement blocks that would sort of stay under Israeli control, and East Jerusalem, which is something that many Israelis would find to be deeply problematic. But to make peace, he made this offer, and the Palestinians once again rejected it without counteroffer. So the question I would have is, how is it possible? How do we move forward when there is a reluctance to make peace? Like what is Israel supposed to do when the Palestinian leadership year after year refuses to come to the negotiation table and make peace?
The word acceptance is a huge word, though, isn't it? Like refusing to accept kind of the way things are. There's examples all around the world of people groups refusing to accept their current circumstance. And it's an interesting one here, Stacey, isn't it? Because quite frankly, we had an audience member yesterday commenting during our interview with the rabbi, saying, "Hey, listen, I acknowledge," this is a Palestinian Canadian making the comment. She said, "I acknowledge the need for a safe state." I'm paraphrasing, for a safe state for Israel. Said history has proven that it's necessary, but why does it need to come at the expense of Palestinians? And herein lies the question, right? To whom is the land entitled? To whom is the real estate, so to speak, entitled? This is the whole premise. This is, in my mind, in my shallow level of understanding, this is part of the reason why there's so much at play here. This is not a small thing. This is people's connection to the land, and two different groups feeling very strongly about it, right?
Very deeply connected, and two groups feeling indigenous to the land as well.
So what do you say to people that call it, we talk about super loaded words, and I know that you've never shied away from a good conversation, Stacey. People talk about apartheid. People say this is the very definition of apartheid. There's two series of laws. There's limited or restricted movement. People are saying like that's what apartheid looks like. What would your counter argument be?
I would say that an apartheid state would not have democratic elections, would not have three parties coming together in a government that's going to be sworn in shortly, one party being on the right, one party being more left. In fact, the leader of the party being somebody who is openly gay, and an Arab Israeli party as well. That doesn't sound like an apartheid state to me.
I've got an interesting. I've just received this email. We've just received it, so I'm just reading it right now. This is from Shane. I appreciate it. I want to ask both of you to respond to this. Adir, maybe we'll go to you first. Shane says it is anti-Semitic to conflate all Jews with the Zionist politics project that is the state of Israel. He says, as an anti-Zionist Jew in the diaspora Israel, and the Zionist leadership does not represent me nor many of my peers. Shane says, end the occupation, equal rights for all, one democratic state. Adir, what would you say to Shane?
It's lots to unpack here. I think before we can jump into it, we have to define what Zionism is. Zionism, and for the vast majority of Jews around the world, surveys show this, in Canada, and then Veronica's a recent study showed that this is true. Zionism, as we see it, is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. It is the belief that Jews are a people and Jews have a right to self-determination in their indigenous homeland, which is the land of Israel. And I recognize that there are some Jews who are anti-Zionist, who are non-Zionist, who don't believe that is the case. And respectfully, that is a fringe minority position that doesn't represent the majority of Jews. And I also want to say that it comes a lot from a position of privilege. Living in in North America, especially in the United States or in Canada, where you can live outside of Israel in safety and security and dignity, and Canada is one of the best places to live, not just as a Jew but as a minority. But the majority of Jews in Israel are actually not from Europe or North America. My family, for example, comes from Libya. They were expelled from Libya. I have relatives who were expelled from Iraq. They were not allowed to take any of their belongings. They were not allowed to take any of their, any money to Israel when they were expelled. And the majority of Jews in Israel are from countries like Morocco or Tunisia or Syria and other places. So to turn this into some sort of thought experiment of, there are 10 million people that live in Israel, let's just dismantle the state and cancel their identity, is not just not representative of the vast majority of Jews around the world. It's dangerous.
Stacey, do you want to add to it?
I would add that the consistent surveys of Israelis and Palestinians demonstrate that one state is not what people want. And it's far for us to say what the people of Israel should be doing and what they want. They have a right to self-determination, as do the Palestinians want self-determination. And the best way that's going to be achieved is with a two-state solution. It's
really interesting to read from this email from Shane. I'm grateful that he wrote in when he says, as what he characterizes as Zionist leadership does not represent me. We've received so many different messages that I'm grateful for from many different perspectives. And there's a common theme talking about different people and different leadership, but there's a theme of people saying this does not represent them. In other words, Hamas does not represent all Palestinians. The Israeli government does not represent all Jews. Benjamin Netanyahu does not represent all Israelis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What do you make of that, Stacey? I mean, can you see that? I'll go to Stacey first. Can you see that from those different angles? I mean, can you see how that might be accurate?
Absolutely. And I would say that our community is not a monolith. And having open discussions around the government politics and policies and perhaps who the leaders are, that is not being anti-Semitic. There's an old joke, Ryan, that when a Jewish person was stranded on an island, he built two synagogues. And when he was found later and they said, well, why do you have two synagogues here? You're one person. And he said, well, there's the one that I go to and the one that I'll never step foot in.
Right.
So it's good to have a healthy debate within the community. But I'll turn it over to Adir and see what he wants to add.
Look, I think we can talk about it in any context. So, with the discovery of, the horrific discovery of the children's bodies in camp loops, does that represent all Canadians? Is that something that we should Canadians abroad be targeted because of the past, tragedies of Canada? Does the Canadian government represent absolutely the view of every single Canadian? The answer is no. People are individuals. They're entitled to their opinions. And, just like in Canada and just like in Israel, as two democracies, people often disagree, and they disagree strongly with their government. We've seen, protests outside of the Prime Minister in Israel is home for months now, right? So this idea of, the state of Israel doesn't represent me, and it's the same as saying, well, the government of Canada doesn't fully encompass all of my views. Of course it doesn't. It's natural, but that is different than saying, I don't identify as part of the majority Jewish community that sees Israel as an essential part and a core component of its Jewish identity, right? So in response to Shane's email, if he's entitled to his opinion, but I think to claim that there is no such connection, he's entitled to say, I do not feel a connection with Israel, which is totally legitimate. But what he can't say is that the Jewish people at large don't have a connection with the land of Israel, because that's just simply false.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to. I appreciate you invoking that tragedy out of Kamloops. I mean, part of Canada's tragic history. What I'm not sure about, where I'm not sure if it stands up, and I'm eager for your response to this, to hear it, is that Canadians now, like it or not, are being forced to grapple with descriptions of what that is. And a big one is cultural genocide. And people are really wrestling with the big word colonialism as well. And I think Canadians and Indigenous people who would not identify as Canadians are both really right now grappling with that and having these conversations. And I don't necessarily have a strong point to make. I'm not trying to draw direct lines, but Stacey, I know you and I have been corresponding off the air. And I don't blame people for writing in. Like I said, I've received many emails about this because we have an engaged audience and people care and people feel very strongly, of course, about their perspectives, about their ethnicity, about their religion, about their origins, their family histories. I mean, of course, people feel strongly about that. But I think sometimes, some of these words, Adir, especially when it comes to Kamloops, and maybe we can draw a line to the conversation that we're having now. Some of the words make us very uncomfortable and cause us to push back in a sense. But sometimes we have to look and say, well, if it's not this, then what is it?
I think that's also proof of what happens when you do oversimplify the conversation and the impact of that on the conversations that we're having in our offices, in our homes, among our youth, that if they don't have the language and the tools to really grapple with and a deeper understanding of the history and the context, then those conversations don't lead to good places. And
Stacey, let's talk about that, because there's sometimes things just need to be plainly stated. And in circumstances like this, I got a message from someone extremely concerned that said, following conversations that they're not blaming the show, but they're saying following some conversations that we had on the show with a couple of Palestinian Canadians who are making strong points from their perspective. They're saying, a couple of days later in the West End of Edmonton, in a prominent Jewish neighborhood, as this person described it, they said there was a car driving around asking where the Jews lived, like seeking to intimidate, using anti-Semitic language, etc. An anecdotal report. I have no reason to believe it wasn't true. I believe that the Edmonton police issued a statement that it was something that they were concerned about. It goes without saying that is entirely and completely unacceptable. We've heard people talking about whether or not criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. We had this conversation yesterday, and it was a very good conversation. What have you noticed, Stacey, trends-wise? What are you hearing from community members on this front when it comes to acts of or sentiments of anti-Semitism, community members being targeted as a result of this, if I can call it an international story?
I'll begin with stating that that incident occurred in my neighborhood, a block away from where I live. So the impact of that is that my children are afraid to go walk the dog around the block now because they know that this car has gone on in the neighborhood. It was not just one incident. There was a series of 6 incidents. I know 3 were reported to the police. I know 3 that were unreported but brought to our attention. And so the impact of that is some fear. And people wondering, should they keep their mezuzahs on their doors? Should they be wearing their Magen Davids in public? Kids going to the local Talmud Torah school, the parents are concerned about their safety and their security. So it does have a deep impact. And I think it is directly related to some of the rhetoric that we're seeing on social media. And there's local sites that the children and teens follow, like YedWave, where there's virulent anti-Semitism. I've heard of an unreported incident that happened at the Kingsway Mall the other day, where a teenager who was wearing a Magen David, and incidentally, family hails from Arab land, so he understands and the Arab conversations that are going on around him. There's a group of youth that said, "Oh, look at that Jew," and then attacked him and threw him down to the ground. So there are impacts definitely that we're experiencing in our community. And then our teens, as particularly, and our young adults who are just entering the workplace, Israel has become a dirty word. They are being vilified if they have names that are obviously Jewish, and people know that they identify with the country, the state of Israel. And many are seeing anti-Semitic cartoons, things with Hitler and Nazi imagery in the cartoons circulating among the high school groups and on some of these sites. And so it really impacts them on a day-to-day basis when they're then going into the classroom with these people who they know have been circulating these things.
Adir, do you sense, I mean, let me ask you on two fronts. Are you sensing, anecdotally or otherwise, an increase in anti-Semitism in Canada? And let me ask you at the same time, well, gosh, I should be careful here. I'm not saying one is the other. I'm not saying one equals the other. But let me say, as an anecdotal observation myself, like I've noticed here's, when the NDP had its federal convention and members started talking about, a resolution on Palestine, my very first inclination was like politically, that's pretty gutsy. Right? Because it wouldn't be the type of thing that typically you would see a federal party seeking to achieve government. This is no offense to my Palestinian friends. I'm just saying it's an extremely hot button issue that most federal political parties would not take a strong position on. And if they did take a strong position in the Western world, it wouldn't be a pro-Palestine position. That's just a fact. What I see now is a lot of people, again, anecdotal. It's people on their social media bios. It's sort of the public expressions. A lot of people with that flag. A lot of people with the Free Palestine hashtag, etc. Are you seeing it? Are you seeing an increase? I mean, are you seeing a change in different sentiments related to this international relationship?
I think we have to be really careful about distinguishing between the legitimate debate that needs to be had about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The rights of Palestinians, the struggle for a state, possible solutions between Israel and the Palestinians, and so on, and what's happening in here. There's never a justification for any form of hate targeting anybody because of an aspect of their identity. So you asked about, am I sensing as anecdotal? It's not anecdotal. We have Statistics Canada that shows that Jews are among the most frequently targeted group when it comes to hate crime year after year after year, and it's completely disproportionate, right? Jews are a fraction of a percent in Canada and are disproportionately targeted. UJA Federation of Greater Toronto here in Toronto reported a 5-fold increase of anti-Semitic incidents in May as a result of what was going on in the rhetoric that has sort of escalated over here because of what was happening there. And one other thing about anti-Semitism that I think is important to mention is that in Canada, we would use the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA, definition of anti-Semitism. And it's a definition that was put together by multiple countries that came together and with experts on hate, anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, including Canada. And it includes examples like targeting Jews or vilifying Jews in their countries because of the actions of the state of Israel, which is anti-Semitic. Denying the Holocaust, for example, is anti-Semitic. Denying Jewish peoplehood, right, or the right to self-determination is anti-Semitic. But it also says, and it's important to reiterate, that criticism of the state of Israel, in the same way that's leveled against any other country, cannot be anti-Semitic. It is an important part of our political discourse. It's an important part of the conversations that we're having. And if you look at conflicts in other countries, nobody is saying, nobody is arguing that we should cancel any other ethnic community because of the politics or even wrongdoings of the state governments of their home countries. There are lots of things going, for example, in China or the Philippines. Nobody is canceling the Lantern Festival. Nobody says we should boycott the Taste of Manila. Why is it that Jews, for whom Israel is a cultural hub, why are they vilified? And as Stacey said, why is Israel a dirty word for kids who probably know very little about the politics or the intricacies of the history, but they know Israel as their cultural hub, as a part of their identity. They want to celebrate Jewish culture that originates in Israel, right? Jew is technically somebody from Judea, which is the region around Israel, around Jerusalem.
I'm grateful for your perspectives here. I know that both of you have to go. We have an interview coming up at 9:00, but I want to leave an opportunity. Oftentimes, some of the most important things we'll talk about in an interview come following the question, is there anything we've missed? Is there anything that we've not touched on that you want to make sure that you enter into debate? People that are going to hear this podcast later today, people that are taking this in live right now. Stacey, you first. What's something that you want people to walk away from and be thinking about in this context?
I think I'd like to see people look to educate themselves more, to understand the language that they're using, the impact of it, that we as Albertans and as Canadians, we are all human beings, and we should be looking to call for unity rather than language that's divisive and incendiary.
Adir?
Yeah, I think, to build on what Stacey said, many communities are here because they wanted to escape the conflict and the physical conflict that's going on, in their countries of origin. Here we have an opportunity to sit down, engage in respectful dialogue, acknowledge the, all of the positions, all of the strong feelings without vilifying, targeting, or spreading hate against any particular group. And it's really up to all of us as Canadians to do that in a respectful way.
Couldn't agree more with the both of you on those points, and I appreciate your perspectives this morning. Stacey Leavitt-Wright with the Jewish Federation of Edmonton, Adir Krafman with the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. Thank you for your time. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
You can be in touch with the show anytime to talk at ryanjesperson.com. You can let me know what you think about what you've just heard. Obviously, it's another perspective. We'll continue to bring you different perspectives relating to this. I see on our live chat, not everybody agrees with what they're hearing here, which is good. It's healthy to disagree and to talk it out. That's what our guests have just said. There's a lot of talk about occupation. There's a lot of talk about rights to the land. I mean, some folks stating the obvious, but it needs to be stated. Echoing what we just heard there from Stacey and Adir. Essentially, important debate, conversation, uncomfortable conversation needs to happen, but targeted acts of violence or hatred can never be accepted. And of course, that's an important point to make. Targeting groups, you feel like, do I even need to say this? And then we look at the tragedy in London, Ontario this week, and it's like maybe as a country, maybe as citizens, we do need to continually remind ourselves that groups based on ethnicity or religion still are targeted on a daily basis. Whether or not that results in acts of cold-blooded murder like we saw in London, Ontario, maybe not every time, but that doesn't mean that people are always feeling safe. It doesn't mean that people are always feeling respected and valued. And certainly this conversation has implications in communities around the world, from both the Palestinian perspective, from the Jewish perspective, or the Israeli perspective, if you will, and those aren't always the same. Important to point out. And we don't know it all. And so we appreciate these types of conversations. We appreciate people that'll make themselves available to come on the show, respond to some of the things that they take issue with, and put important things in front of you and in front of me for our consideration. These conversations happen because we have partners that back us each and every show, like the builders at Eden Landscaping. This is the time of year where they're finally outside. All the crews are going, rain or shine, day in, day out, building dreams into reality. You've been staring out at your front or your backyard all winter into the spring, just going, is this the year we're going to finally make that change? Your realtor keeps talking about curb appeal, but you're not really in the mood to do all the work yourself. Give Eden Landscaping a call. You can find all their details at landscapeedmonton.ca. More than 20 years experience, 20 years turning dreams into reality at Eden Landscaping. Also, big shout out to the teams at the Dairy Queens of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park. They've got you all set for Father's Day. That's right. At these 6 Dairy Queens, as long as you mention Real Talk or drop my name, Jespo, they're going to give you a Father's Day cake. This is the famous Dairy Queen Father's Day cake. It's the one that Dad wants for $5 off. All you have to do is mention Real Talk or Jespo at Palisades, Nemeo, Newcastle, Westmount, Y Gardens, or Baseline Road. $5 off Father's Day cakes. They're also collecting donations for the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation. They wanted me to mention that to you. And speaking of Father's Day, the team at Friesen Brothers is getting set to roll out their Father's Day boxes. This is the solution for the Father's Day weekend. If you feel like doing less work, spending more time with Dad, they've got their world-famous sourdough cinnamon buns. They've got the sausage coils. They've got this great chicken and cheese dip, fabulous produce, beautiful Alberta beef to hit the grill. It's the Father's Day box at the Fort Saskatchewan, Edmonton, and Stony Plain locations. Friesen Brothers for more than 65 years. Alberta grown and Alberta owned. In just a second, we're going to talk about healthcare, and we're going to talk about communities in Canada, more specifically, people that have been denied equitable access to healthcare. It's a theme that keeps popping up in conversations that we're having here on the show, and we'll be checking in with Dr. Angela Mashford-Pringle in just a moment. Also wanted to touch on some news that people are certainly buzzing about here in our neck of the woods in the province of Alberta right now. Confirmed yesterday. I hate to be the bearer of this news if you're just hearing it for the first time, but TransCanada, TC Energy, and the Alberta government announcing yesterday the death. They stuck a fork in the Keystone XL pipeline. I mean, essentially, we can be guilty of oversimplifying issues here on a talk show like this, and we endeavor to do the opposite. But basically, this came down to who was going to be sitting in the Oval Office. I mean, that's basically what this came down to, right? Now, President Donald Trump may not have been able to do anything about the court challenges around KXL, and we can get into the weeds on that, but at least there was an advocate for the pipeline project. At least there was an American president cheering for it. That's what would have sold the Alberta government on making $1.5 billion investment in that pipeline. As that pipeline was wavering in the wind, as there was uncertainty swirling about, the Premier of Alberta told Albertans that the investment was necessary to keep the pipeline going through that period of uncertainty. A bunch of loan guarantees as well as part of that commitment from the government. Of course, on the flip side was President Joe Biden, who, as you know, won the election, 46 in the Oval Office now, and one of the very first things he did, literally, was to kill that pipeline. Was to essentially pull a presidential permit, if you will. Not entirely accurate, but he signed off on the death of the pipeline, and that's been the case ever since. You remember Jason Kenney had strong words for the White House on the day of Joe Biden's inauguration. I think the majority of people just looked at it and said, hey, you bet on a Trump win and you lost. Well, it was made official yesterday. The price tag, $1.3 billion. I saw somebody tweet today, and I've not fact-checked it for accuracy, but they had a blue check mark, so it must be true. Said, if you took $10,000 a day and squirreled it away every day since the Hudson's Bay Company started doing business in Canada, you still would not reach the total that the Alberta government just spent on Keystone XL. That, to me, was pretty big. That was one you can try to wrap your mind around. Sarah Hoyles is looking at me like, are we really going to be doing that math? Are we really going to be doing that
Please
math?
Don't do math right now.
Don't do that math right now.
But I think, regardless of, with the blue check mark and, if we're doing that math correctly, if we look at $1.3 billion, I think a lot of folks are saying, what could that have done as far as addressing houselessness? What would that $1.3 million have done for healthcare or teachers or education? So, a lot.
Yeah.
I don't have to get out a calculator to know that 1.3 billion would have done a heck of a lot.
And the premier would probably argue back, or the premier staff would probably argue back that, hey, listen, nobody else was there to step up for this pipeline. And had we not stepped up for the pipeline, then it would have been killed even earlier, and those jobs wouldn't have been there. And then most people would have said, listen to this government advocating for government to prop up businesses that aren't viable. It just doesn't really make sense to have the government in the mix the whole time. Isn't it weird to have a government take big pot shots at another government, like the federal government, for buying a pipeline, right? The Trans Mountain, the expansion. Canadians own it now, for now anyway. Canadians own it. So very critical of the federal government for buying that pipeline, yet investing in a pipeline with obviously fewer reasons for optimism, and now that pipeline's dead. So is it easy to look back and to point fingers and say this was a dumb investment? Maybe. I mean, I would point to the fact that a lot of people are on the record having called this a stupid idea from the very beginning. This was a premier, I think, sending a message to his base that at the expense of Alberta's bottom line, he was willing to do absolutely whatever he possibly could to try to save that project. It's not a government that's established itself that has established a track record of being able to say we are the fiscally prudent, we are the fiscally responsible Conservatives. There's not evidence of that anywhere, and this would be one of those examples. This, meantime, as an independent conservative media outlet, Western Standard out of Southern Alberta. Of course, everybody that pays attention to Western Canadian politics knows the name Derek Fildebrandt, a former MLA, formerly of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and a thorn in Jason Kenney's side. An exclusive story yesterday that the premier and his inner circle had been attending private dinners at a secret restaurant. Now, this is fascinating. It's an ongoing trend of attacks from within. The calls are coming from within the House. Now, anybody would scoff. Anybody close to senior United Conservative cabinet, let alone the Premier's office, would say Derek Fildebrandt is not inside the House. Certainly not inside the House. But this is the drip, 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 drip technique that we've seen work so many times in politics before. Every few days, there's another story. And if you're the premier, you got to be wondering what's coming out next. You've got the Sky Palace supper photos. And I'll maybe load up our live chat right now so I can look at it. I can't look at it all the time. It's too distracting for me. You guys are too smart. You're talking about too many things at too high of a level. I can't wrap my mind around it. I can't walk and chew gum at the same time. But I want to load it up here because I know that the live chat's going to remind me of things that I'm forgetting when it comes to this slow drip, right? But you've got these photos through a telephoto lens. I just like saying telephoto. It's just such a great word. The images through a telephoto lens.
It is a wonderful moment in a young photographer's life when they get their first legit telephoto
when
lens.
You shoot for the first time,
it's nice.
And that image stabilizer starts working, and you're holding this long lens. And anyway,
Guys.
Sorry, it's too bad that camera shop's not still advertising with us, or we could talk about where you could get them. And
but they're not.
So we won't.
But if there are camera companies out there
that would like to partner with us, we've got a guest online right now. She's like, you guys going to talk to me? Or so you've got the Sky Palace supper photos through the telephoto lens. Let's rewind a little bit further. You've got the 16, 17 MLAs, including the speaker, right, that signed this letter essentially calling for the government to wrap up and get rid of its lockdown measures. You have dissension from within the ranks. You have Todd Loewen resign as caucus chair. You have Drew Barnes speak out. And come on, real talk. Then you've got both these guys booted from the party, right? You've got Angela Pitt speaking out. You have Cabinet Minister Leela Adir calling on the Premier to apologize for the Sky Palace supper. Jason Kenney then does apologize. Then you get this story in the Western Standard about the Premier's dinners at this private restaurant, this private facility. You've got Brian Jean, former leader of Alberta's official opposition, former federal MP, former candidate for the leadership of this party, the alleged target of the alleged kamikaze campaign, still being investigated by RCMP. Drip, 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 right? Marco's watching, says the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, the Fraser Institute, silent right now on the $1.5 billion pipeline boondoggle. You're not wrong. I do see the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is stepping up and applauding this government for its equalization referendum, which is absolutely ridiculous, and we're going to be talking about that. I'm so excited for next week's question of the week. That's all I'll say for now. This is one of those times where I'm really going to say I shouldn't get into it, and I'm really not going to get into it. But next week's question of the week is going to raise a few eyebrows across the province. So this isn't Rachel Notley scoring points. I mean, Rachel Notley, I guess, is probably scoring some points, but they're not the ones throwing the hand grenades here. These are conservatives. That drip, drip, drip strategy, every single example I gave you. I mean, we don't know who submitted the photos of that Sky Palace supper. It's irresponsible for me to publicly say who is alleged to have potentially snapped those photos. But let me just say, I have said that person's name in the last 3 minutes. It is believed that the photos may have been supplied based on people going all CSI and figuring out where the sun was in the sky and the camera angles and what buildings would be around to provide those and who has offices in those buildings and who would have known that these things were going on. That's what's catching my attention on this. This isn't the opposition. The knives are out. And you got to wonder what's next. We'll continue to follow that story. Daniel says, I'm looking forward to next week. Me too, pal. Randy's wondering, has anybody told the war room yet? I'm sure. Alert the war room. Randy, I'm sure that they're combing Amazon Prime and Netflix right now to find an example of something they can attack to distract the Albertan people, to take your attention off what's going on right now. Some random guy says, Corey Hogan of The Strategist, great podcast. We're going to have to get The Strategist back on this show. That Strategist roundtable they did with us, one of the greatest ones. Says he's got an evergreen piece of advice. Never interrupt your enemy when they're fumbling. If you're the official opposition right now, you're just sitting back and watching. Do not get in the way of whatever's happening with this government. We'll get to your emails a little later on in the show. We're 45 minutes away from talking about what's going on with Bitcoin. Big plunge with Bitcoin. Meantime, at the same time, El Salvador adds it as an official currency. We're going to talk to a Forbes contributor, plus Adam O'Brien from Bitcoin. Well, right now, it's my pleasure to return to a story that demands our attention. We've been talking about systemic racism in healthcare. We've been talking about Indigenous people in Canada being denied equitable access to healthcare for well over 100 years. This is Dr. Angela Mashford-Pringle's wheelhouse. The doctor is an Indigenous health expert, a professor, associate director at the Waakebiness-Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Doctor, thank you so much for making time for us and welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. And this is such an important topic, something that people aren't talking enough about right now.
100% agree with you, except for the fact that it keeps coming up in almost every conversation we've been having, in particular. And I fear that this number, when I say the 215, I mean it in reverence. When you say a number, I think in Canada there's probably two you can say. I think you can say 99, and everybody thinks of Wayne Gretzky in a positive sense. I think if you say the 215, I think Canadians will find themselves at a point of somber reflection. It has prompted, this horrific discovery has prompted so many conversations. Are you seeing that from your angle as well?
Oh, definitely. Unfortunately, there's not enough of those conversations. And, we have stacks of reports about healthcare, about the residential schools, and absolutely nothing was talked about, really. And so to have people interested, to have people wanting to go and understand what the issues are is really, really important, especially when you're starting to look at Joyce Echequan, who Facebook lived her own death in Quebec. And, they had the Vence Commission in 2019, which was before her death, and nothing had been done about the recommendations they had there. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People was put out in 1996. There was 440 recommendations. Nothing was done. We went through failed constitutional talks between 1984 and 2005. And when we finally get to an agreement, which was supposed to be the blueprint on Indigenous peoples in 2005, we changed governments, and the Conservatives coming in said they weren't going to fund the blueprint. So we have tons of evidence as to why we need to talk about this and what it's doing or not doing. And it just seems that it always gets put to the side because there's always something more urgent, whether it's the economy or there's COVID going on. Yeah, well, while that's going on, we still have people who can't get to healthcare.
Why is it, doctor? I mean, is it as simple as saying racism? I mean, is it that simple?
Yes, it is actually that simple. I mean, you think about the Indian Act, you think about how you're in Alberta, Treaty 6 is there, the medicine chest clause is part of Treaty 6. The idea that it was supposed to be set up so that we would have, some form of healthcare for Indigenous people, First Nations people, and then, the governments continually say it's not their fiduciary responsibility to provide that healthcare, and non-insured health benefits that went through the court systems back in the 1930s. And it was agreed that this is something that we need to be doing. And yet we still have the government fighting for $10,000 braces for a young girl. They spent $100,000 in court fees. So you tell me, is that not racism?
When we talk about health, I mean, we can talk about access to healthcare. We can talk about quality of healthcare. We can talk about the healthcare experience. We can certainly talk about things like quality of water. We can talk about nutrition. How do you approach this conversation? Because if we simply say, I was talking to somebody yesterday when we had confirmed you to come on the show, somebody who feels very strongly and passionately about issues. She's a very engaged citizen. And I said that you were coming on, and she said she's a dietitian. She's a nutritionist. And she's been heartbroken about what we're learning about the reality in these residential schools, and many of these residential schools where Basil Johnson had reported the duration of the residential school from 1939 to 1950 that, quote, hunger was never absent, right? That these kids were, these students, they say, were fed just enough to blunt the sharp edge of hunger, but never enough to dispel it. They talk about how the calories that these children would have received would have been far fewer than they would have needed for growing bodies. They talked about the poor quality of food. They talked about these children being used almost in an experimental sense to compare the effects of different fortified foods. I mean, this is a conversation about healthcare, isn't it?
Yeah. And you know what? When they would get sick, if they didn't die at the school, they would send them to Indian hospitals like Charles Camsell
in Edmonton.
And right. And that would be another place that they would die. Or they would send them there and they'd say, hey, we're going to look after you. And they would sterilize our girls so that they couldn't have any babies after they left the residential schools. That's racism. It's still happening today. I just heard recently from a Métis lawyer in BC that he has clients who social workers took a 10-year-old Indigenous girl to a doctor and got an IUD put in so that she wouldn't get pregnant while she was in the foster care system. So that's racism. We can't hide it. We do a wonderful job in Canada of pretending like it's not happening, but it's happening. When you talk about the foods in the residential schools, there's lots of papers on this. Ian Mosby's like the forerunner in talking about this. And Frederick Tisdale, who's out of Sick Kids Hospital here in Toronto, was doing experiments on pablum and formula. So they were not feeding the infants. And we're talking about like within our lifetimes, you and I, our lifetimes, we're not talking 150 years ago. We're talking, between the 1940s and the 1990s that this stuff was actually happening. And so when you start talking about that, you've got to think, why is it Canadians don't know this stuff?
We're I think, trying to scale up our knowledge and understanding quickly. And I say that with hesitation or trepidation, maybe, because I acknowledge that storytellers and elders and survivors have been providing the information and making the information available in different contexts for quite some time. And for whatever reason, the story really has flown under Canadians' radar. Everybody knew about residential schools in a way. Everybody knew that it was some sort of a smear on Canada's record. We knew that in a way because it would be used by people in sentences. People that would say, oh, Canada doesn't get a pass. We had residential schools and Japanese internment camps and, there was, discrimination against other, and people would say, oh, yeah, I guess Canada, but we didn't really know, did we? And then somebody like Angela White comes on the show yesterday from the Indian Residential School Survivor Society, and she starts telling us about dentists that would be paid per tooth extraction. And she says, why do you think so many residential school survivors wear full dentures? And I'm sitting there, and to be honest with you, I barely heard anything she said for the next 5 minutes because I was trying to reconcile that,
Honestly, even now, so I've gone into some of the remote and flying-in communities and all over Canada. And do you know that Indian and Northern Affairs, or what's now known as Indigenous services, will only pay for mercury fillings for people? Whereas we get those nice white veneer fillings that you can't see. They won't pay for those for Indigenous people. And on top of that, when a kid is like 4 and 5 years old, if they have one cavity, they put those mercury fillings from one side to the other. There is no teeth to be seen. It's just silver. And they're doing that because they say the dentist only comes up once every 6 weeks to 2 months, right? So you have to do something so that the cavities don't get so bad that they can't chew. And that's their answer to it. Never mind, we haven't even talked about suicide or depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or intergenerational and intragenerational, because it's not just one generation to a next, it's within a generation. So, while I didn't go to residential schools, there was always that fear that I could be going to a residential school if they, came after my mom. So
is that right, Angela? Like you lived with that personally. That was something that you would see that around you, or that was something that you perceived, or that was a very real possibility.
Oh yes. And I remember, you'd have a fight with your parent, and you knew that you couldn't. And kids always have fights with their parents, especially when they're growing up. And you would think, oh my God, if this fight's really bad, and something happens, they're going to phone child welfare and I'm never going to see my parent again. And that's a sad reality even today. Like Cindy Blackstock talks about this all the time. She's taken the federal government to court. There's 9 injunctions against the federal government to actually pay child welfare at the rates we pay it for non-Indigenous people. And yet they keep fighting us in court. They don't want to pay it. They're finding ways to fight Indigenous people. And then they come on air and you'll see Mark Miller or Carolyn Bennett saying, hey, look, we're doing all this wonderful stuff for the water. When in fact, they give you the money. I've been to communities where they gave them the money. They start up the water treatment plant, but they don't give them the money to run it, to have training, ongoing training. They don't give them the money for new filters, which you need to keep those treatment plants going. They bring in people who will come and do the work for a short period of time or spend the money of the community. And then they want to put some of our communities in third-party management because they're saying, oh, you're mismanaging the funds. Another thing is we have something called the health transfer policy. Many communities have gotten to take over their health care. I say this in quotes because, when they signed it back in 1986 to 1989 or even into the 90s, they won't raise the amount that they're giving them. So whatever you were given back in, say, 86 is the same amount you're getting today, even if your community grew. They also tell you what you can actually offer. They don't just let you decide, hey, I want to do a diabetes program right now because that's rampant, or we have a lot of young children and we need to do some, perinatal care for moms and young kids. They tell you what you need to do. So they'll tell you that you have to do the vaccine clinics and you have to do wound care. And that takes away from whatever the community actually needs. So, even though they can come out and say, look, we're putting X amount of dollars to this, they're not telling you that they're treating us still under the British North America Act. They made us wards of the state and they're still treating us that way. Doesn't matter where you live.
We're talking to Dr. Angela Mashford-Pringle. If you're just tuning in, streaming our audio live on the Mixlr audio app. If you want to hear our interviews in past with Dr. Cindy Blackstock, that was on Monday. That'll be June 7th. Angela White from the Indian Residential School Survivor Society was on Tuesday. That would be the 8th of June. So, Angela, I mean, we're here, when I say to you, we're going to come in, we're going to talk about Indigenous health. I mean, the reality is probably we need to book you for about 4 hours because, I mean, we can talk about the past, we can talk about the present, and we can talk about the future. One of the really interesting things, I mean, you invoke the death of Joyce Echaquan, and what was really remarkable, I think, I mean, it's a tragic and heartbreaking story. I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of people. She was able to, and not because of some sort of a great, grand, cooked-up plan, I think, to invoke social media to wake up a nation. I don't think that's what the case was. I mean, she, initially, my understanding is that she was using Facebook live videos during hospital visits because she required translation. Like, that was the beginning of it, right? In a sense. And please feel free to correct my details. But because of that Facebook Live and because of the digital record, then people were able to see what proved really to be irrefutable evidence that she was treated very poorly in the hospital. And like you said, she ultimately died on September 28th of last year. Francois Legault, the Premier of Quebec, condemned the medical staff's comments toward her, and he did call them racist. However, the Premier of Quebec denied systemic racism having any involvement in her death. Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, called it the worst form of racism. You mentioned Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller. He did apologize to her family for the incident, for whatever it's worth. I think perhaps...
But that's a person's life, and she had 7 kids. Like, what happened? This is where that inter and intra trauma comes from, because now those kids are going to live with that, knowing how their mother passed, right? And then that brings you back to Brian Sinclair. And I just heard about another lady in Quebec where she went to the exact same hospital at Juliet, and she was asked by one of the nurses, do you mind if I call you Joyce? That's racist. That's a microaggression. That's not hiding it. And so we're seeing it come out more and more. Canadians actually have to stand up and say, okay, I want to self-reflect on my power, my privilege, my position in life. What can I do to change this? I know Dr. Carrington had talked about this, when she was talking about Kamloops. And I just really think that there's an important issue here that we're not talking about, which is we pretend like everything's okay so we can keep status quo going. You were talking earlier about the pipelines and how they were keeping those going. That's ignoring Indigenous rights, and that's ignoring the fact that we only have one land, one climate. When that's over, it's over, and that's part of our health. And we're ignoring it like it's nobody's business. We can keep burning fossil fuels forever. Yeah, we may have them, but we know what it's doing to the environment, which is also doing something to everybody's health. Our air quality is horrible. However, when COVID hit, go back and look at the air quality numbers, and I'll tell you, for the month of March 2020, they were the best they've been in the last 50 years because there was no planes in the air and we had almost no cars on the road. So that tells you a lot about burning fossil fuels. We have to think about what we're doing. Every little thing affects our health.
It's interesting that every single comment or observation that you've made here would qualify as a comment on health, but you and I are all over the map, which is kind of the point, right? It's kind of the point. It demonstrates, I think it proves that we need to have fulsome conversations here. Let me return, though, to the comments about Quebec Premier Legault, because here's what I think. I take that as the premier. I mean, a premier or a prime minister invoking the word racism is important. However, calling the comments or the actions of those healthcare professionals, those nurses or doctors, whatever you want to be, in this circumstance, I'm talking about this experience described as racist, that allows it to be a one-off in public perception, right? To invoke systemic racism all of a sudden makes this not a cluck, cluck, tisk, tisk, those healthcare workers in Quebec, those racist healthcare workers. It makes it or demands more of a conversation about our entire structure, about this entire country, right? And I wonder if that's maybe why Quebec's premier denied this being evidence of systemic racism. What do you think?
Oh, I definitely think so. And to be honest with you, I know I have research that I have yet to publish. It's not been made public, but I can tell you governments have used healthcare as another form of assimilation, just like residential schools. We haven't talked about it yet. It's not in the literature. You're not going to find it in a book or online yet. And what I know for a fact is that premiers like Legault, like Ford, they say things, they say they're going to do these things, they're going to change things, but nothing ever changes. We've been through this road for the last, at least 50 years where they say they're going to make change and then nothing ever comes of it. When Brian Sinclair died in 2008, I thought we would see systemic change. Nothing happened. We even had an Inuit minister of health at the federal level, and that didn't change anything. So that tells you how entrenched status quo is. And it's not just, if you change healthcare for Indigenous people and you recognize that the systemic racism that's in healthcare is happening not just for us, but for other made vulnerable populations, then we actually might get somewhere. We might actually get to a point where Indigenous and made vulnerable peoples can go in and feel safe to talk to their doctor, nurse, or whoever it is. The problem is right now you come in, you have 15 minutes to say your story. And sometimes we're afraid to say things because we've already experienced racism. So you're not going to tell the doctor or the nurse that you're having heart pain if you don't like them or they're saying something racist to you. You're going to kind of sit there and take whatever they tell you that they think is wrong with you and walk back out the door. And then, then we have long-term health problems, right? Like it's not just a today problem. This is a long-term problem, and it's not just happening to Indigenous people. However, I can talk well on that point, but I know it's happening to other groups, and we're not talking about it. We're not changing medical education fast enough, and the only reason we wouldn't do like rapid major overhaul, and it should start in kindergarten to grade 12 all the way through to post-secondary, and change things so that we have actual education that is educating you how to be a human being again, because that's what we've forgotten.
Angela, I want to talk about that because you may or may not. It sounds like you pay pretty close attention. First of all, thank you for taking an interest in the show outside of episodes on which you are appearing. I really appreciate your familiarity with our roster and with some of our past interviews. You know then that we've spent plenty of time, probably still not enough, but plenty of time talking about Alberta's curriculum. You want to talk about the importance of educating kids early. I mean, people here are concerned. Millions of people here are concerned that we're actually moving in the wrong direction there, that we're actually taking steps backward when we perceive that the rest of the country is in a position to at least have an appetite to move forward. Do you sense that this discovery in Kamloops, and we know there will be more,
yes.
Do you sense that the public attitude, that there's a groundswell here that a government cannot ignore, that provincial and federal governments cannot ignore? Are you optimistic that the nation is at a point now that it has not been before? Or do you think that this might fizzle out like everything else? Is that a fear that you have?
I'm hopeful, but I'm also a realist. And I've watched this happen many times. The RCAP came out, people got it. Let's go backwards. The OCA happened in 1990. People got really upset. You're going to build a golf course on somebody's land. That actually got a lot of people talking about Indigenous issues. Then we had the RCAP come out. All of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. It's 4,000 pages. It's not like it's a small document. It told you everything. And after that, they created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We get the apology in 2008. That didn't stir it on. Brian Sinclair dies. That didn't stir it on. We've had inquests. Cindy Blackstock has been fighting the government on Jordan's Principles since like 2009.
Idle No More.
Idle No More happened. We were having like protests. The wet, sweating people are standing in front of the pipeline and people don't seem to care, or they're angry because they're doing it instead of going, well, wait, why are you standing there? What does this mean? They get angry, right? So I'm hopeful that this has had people go, wait a second, why didn't I learn this in school? But I'm also a realist in saying that, at least in Ontario, it's only in the curriculum in grade 3, grade 6, a little bit in grade 8, and maybe one module, so maybe a couple days in grade 10. That's all you ever learn about Indigenous people. Why is it like that?
Yeah,
I know for a fact we could put way more in there.
Well, and I think that people like people have a desire to know. I think that a lot of people and I think some people feel almost like bashful is not a strong enough word, but people are embarrassed and people are ashamed. I know that that's a heavy word to use, and it probably fits. I mean, people are saying, I didn't know about residential schools. People are saying, and these are people that aren't like 95 years old. You know, people that are around my age, like middle age, saying, I don't remember talking about this in school. And if we did, we sure didn't talk about it very much. Right? I mean, some circumstances, people are saying people's schools were just down the road from former Indian residential schools. Some people were in close proximity to schools that were still operating in the 1990s.
Yep. And you think about it, Gord Downey tried to bring awareness to this before his death, right? He did the Cheney Wenjack, and bless him, he did all of that work. Where did that go? So this 215 children, you know, I bless their souls for trying to wake everybody up, but will it? You know, I want to hope that that's where we're going to go, but we need to change our school systems. We have gotten to the point where we think we're like the Americans, and we teach our kids about how to get ready for a test. Every province in Canada, and I believe the territories as well, have standardized tests that everybody's got to take. And those standardized tests tell us nothing about the teacher. They don't tell us where the kids are at. We need to get back to real. Like, we need to have teachers who know stuff and that we're going to deal with. Like, I remember, I'm going to age myself, back in the 70s and 80s, that when we had teachers, they taught us what they knew best or what intrigued them. And if you look at the Finland model, that's exactly what they're doing, is they're paying teachers their summer salary for 4 months of the year. They go and learn about something new so that when they come in the classroom, they can sit down and go, Ryan, this is what we're going to talk about this year. And so you get a sense of how excited they are about the topic, which helps to get you excited. And the one thing we need in the 21st century is creative, imaginative, critical thinkers. And we don't turn those out of high school. Like, that's not happening.
So, Angela, people will say, okay, hang on a second. You guys are talking about, nutrition in residential schools, and then you're talking about people, Indigenous people being denied, quality healthcare in many different circumstances, many different realities. By the way, we've heard from healthcare workers. I remember I mentioned Dr. Bukala Islami. She joined us from the University of Alberta's Faculty of Nursing a while ago. I guess it was maybe about a month ago or so. And I think it was the beginning of May, right? May 5th, I think she was on. And she talked about, she's like, it's undeniable. And after she came on, we started getting notes from people that were like, I see it. People like, please don't use my name if you read this letter, but I see it. I work at this place. I see it. And then people are going to go, but hang on a second. Now the doctor and Jesper are talking about kindergarten and grade 3 curriculum. So let me ask a question that may have an obvious answer. But when you talk about addressing racism in healthcare, among healthcare professionals, we're not calling every healthcare professional a racist, but we're talking about systemic racism in the system of delivery, in the structure. Why is elementary school curriculum so important? Are you talking about because we're graduating the future doctors, nurses, surgeons, triage professionals? Is that why?
Yeah, I've actually written a paper that says health and education are interconnected. There is no way to separate them. It's also your health literacy. Do you know when you're supposed to go to an emergency room? Do you know when you're supposed to go see a doctor? Did anybody ever teach you that, like in a formal way? Or did your parents just tell you this is when you go? And because we have free healthcare, we go at different times. So people that are new to our country, doesn't matter how they got here, really doesn't, if they've been here in the last 5 to 10 years, they've never been taught, when do you go to an emergency room? What warrants an emergency room visit? And then we wonder why our healthcare costs go up. Well, because we haven't taught you anything. We haven't given you literacy. Why isn't that part of our K-12 curriculum? Why aren't we teaching people about how important land is? If we're not taking care of the plants, the trees, the animals, the soil, the water, the birds, the insects, guess what? We're not going to have a planet in 50 years. I don't even think it will take that long. Because we're already seeing the change, right? We're already seeing climate change. This all comes from teaching our children from kindergarten all the way through to grade 12. Then when they get to medical school, they don't have to come and listen to me lecture to them for 3 hours about stuff that they should have learned at some point in their lives. And they will be better informed as consumers of healthcare because we teach it in K to 12, and they'll know when they have to go to a doctor and what does it mean to go to a doctor. And maybe if our healthcare systems weren't so regimented that you only get 15 minutes with a doctor, then maybe we could actually get to the point of looking at holistic problems, because looking at the ones, the set of symptoms, saying it's this diagnosis, giving a treatment and booting somebody out the door doesn't tell you if there's, domestic violence going on in the home, somebody has suicidal ideation, somebody's using drugs, they're homeless, or they're temporarily houseless. None of those things are being talked about. We're not talking about it in K to 12. So then doctors, you go into the doctor's office, you talk to him for 15 minutes, he knows nothing about you, him or her. And I think that it's important that we start talking about doing more holistic treatment. I'm not saying everybody should have an Indigenous healer. That's not where I'm going. It would be lovely if we had that too, but I'm talking about just our general Western biomedical healthcare. Why is it you only get 15 minutes and that's all that a provincial government will pay for, when in reality they should be knowing more about you so that they can make a proper diagnosis? Maybe it's about something that's not about the symptom you came in with. We have to be better.
You've just opened up you have not opened up a can. You have opened up a barrel of worms now. And then I can talk to you about, and this is a national interview. We're talking to you from Toronto, and the country is going to listen to this, and I'm going to bring it back to Alberta, where the dust up between the Ministry of Health and the doctors here is also included. Mm-hmm. The health minister pulling away a bunch of health modifier codes, which we won't get in the weeds. It gets boring, but this is how physicians are able to reflect spending more time with their patients. They can tack on $9 or $11 or whatever the modifier code is, so they can spend a bit more time. But as business persons themselves with full waiting rooms, without those modifier codes, it's a guarantee that the appointments are going to stay at 15 minutes because they have to generate that many patients going through to be able to keep their lights on. I mean, this is an entirely different conversation, but it's all intertwined. Yes. That's the theme of what we're realizing here, isn't it? These are all intertwined.
And we can't separate them. No matter how much you try, we can't separate them. And in fact, if they would up the number of people who can go into nurse practitioner degrees, right? And we would allow midwives to have the same amount of say as a doctor does. If nurses actually got paid for what they actually do, oh my God, what a change in our world that would be. Nurse practitioners are supposed to be the equivalent to doctors, but one step down. I didn't make that rule. That's the way it is. But we could technically increase the number of nurse practitioners. We could do a lot. I'm telling you, if we looked at somebody sitting down and talking for 30 minutes with a healthcare provider, we might actually save a lot more money than saying, hey, put a $9 code on there, and we'd save a lot more lives. We would change that. That's a very upstream approach to change. And I do public health, I do healthcare, and I can tell you that if we're not going to do this upstream approach, we're paying for it downstream. So you don't deal with the 15-year-old who's feeling a little depressed and comes in very sheepishly to talk to a healthcare professional, and they don't ask any questions about what's going on in their life outside of that, that issue. You're sending them back to further mull around in that space in their head that's telling them this is a horrible world. And then we're wondering why we have high suicide rates. And I don't mean this just amongst Indigenous people. This is everybody. We're wondering why that 15-year-old, when he's 30, is having problems keeping a job, which means he can't feed his family or he's not eating. So we have food insecurity problems. Like this is a systemic thing, right? Like this is like systemic racism. Our institutions are broke. They were meant for a smaller population who had a much different base of work, and they were cracked up and made up in 150, 200 years ago by a government that wasn't even on our shores. The British made up some of our laws. They made up some of the things that we do, the things that we take for granted. So if we're actually going to do something, let's step up, Canada. We've got to figure out what it is we want. Where are we going? We can't keep pretending like climate change isn't happening. We can't pretend like systemic racism isn't happening. And we certainly can't pretend like this is great and we want to go to post-COVID because we want it all back the way it was. Well, guess what? It wasn't working for 90% of us. So let's not go there.
Dr. Angela Mashford-Pringle, our guest. It's so fascinating. I mean, it's like what I'm making such an obvious statement here, but conversations about healthcare, health policy, in my mind, have evolved to include conversations about things like racism, environmentalism, and like you didn't hear that. I mean, I'm thinking even over the course of my career, which is the last 15 years or so, that window as an interviewer. I mean, that evolution is happening, which I think is interesting, and it's encouraging to me because it does indicate an awareness of more of a holistic approach. You talk about Indigenous medicines or an Indigenous approach to healthcare. When you talk about autonomy, which I'm sure you will argue does not exist and has never existed, but what might, I mean, if we were to paint a picture of what the future could look like, and it may look different, in a downtown Vancouver setting or in Montreal as it may in a remote Indigenous community in northern Manitoba, for example. It may look different. But how do you see healthcare? Let's call it intuitive healthcare. Let's call it healthcare that respects traditions. Let's call it healthcare as a result of, can I say, a I'll acknowledge reconciliation would be an ongoing commitment, but if I can say post-reconciliation or a woke healthcare design, what might it look like?
Well, when I wrote my dissertation, that was just under 10 years ago, and what I called the ideal First Nations healthcare system would include traditional healing. So that would be using our traditional medicines, but also having access to biomedicine so that the healers could talk to the doctors. They don't want to be separated, but they're also busy doing their work that they don't get a chance to talk about a patient very often. So, having some kind of hybrid Indigenous health teams, which I know Northern Health in BC has. And if you look at South Central Foundation in Alaska, the Alaskan Native people have now owned their hospital, so they get to dictate what happens. And I was talking to a colleague in Hawaii, and they grow the traditional medicines just outside the door. Now, mind you, in Hawaii, they can do that. We can't do that in our winters. But, can you imagine you could have traditional healers coming, picking the medicines they need and going in and talking to the patient in a hospital or in a clinic. And why is that? We can't do that. Like, what's preventing us? I can tell you one of the things, government said, yeah, you can have traditional healers, but we want to accredit them like we do doctors. Hello, it's a lifetime process to become a healer. And residential schools pretty much wiped out most of our healers. We have healers, but it takes a long time to learn them. And, you can't accredit that. That's not like becoming a nurse or a doctor. This is like a lifetime of learning where to pick the medicines, what the medicines are used for. And
so would that be like an individual that came with, for lack of a better word, that came with the endorsement of an Indigenous community?
Yes, definitely.
Like,
and
so,
that's what
recognized as a healer, but not government accredited through a college, for example.
Right. And I think that's where governments get scared because they can't regulate it. And that's what they're so used to doing. And so, they're just like, no, can't do this. It's phenomenal. We could talk for hours because there's so many little pieces that are missing that we're, I think about not many years ago, Chinese medicine or Eastern medicine was not allowed in our hospitals or in our healthcare spaces. And now people go for acupuncture like it's nobody's business. I'm not saying that it's only a Chinese medicine, but like, this is exactly what I'm getting at is there's so much out there that we haven't even talked about. And and literacy, people need to know, when do you go do that? When do you go to a naturopath? When do you go to a traditional healer?
Yeah.
We don't tell them any of these things. There's so much, so much.
My this is just a throwaway comment, but my wife goes to a pretty interesting health clinic. It's where she gets her personal health care, and she has a physician there, and she also has an acupuncturist, and she also has a nutritionist, and she also has a holistic professional that works with her on some of the more, I would say unconventional, but probably the word is traditional, right? Some of the more traditional methods. I mean, it's a really interesting it's a really interesting structure, this clinic and how it's organized. Because you do have the GP, the family doctors there working in concert with all the others. If you were to apply an Indigenous approach there, and first and foremost make it available, readily available and accessible and non-threatening, as a matter of fact, inviting in these communities, I think you'd see remarkable results. We've touched on mental health, and there have been alarm bells ringing.
Yes.
In particular, death by suicide is an enormous issue across the country, as you've mentioned, with non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. But we do see disproportionate rates. As a matter of fact, in some communities, we've seen states of emergencies declared because of so many deaths by suicide over short periods of time, in many cases, tragically involving young people. We could talk for hours about how tragedies like these occur over time with regards to a loss of culture, to a loss of identity, to a loss of confidence, to a loss of trust. There are so many things that factor in. But how do we begin to address, do you think, talking about health, mental health is a huge part of it. How do we begin to address that with Indigenous people and Indigenous communities?
We need to talk about the truth, which brings us back to Kamloops. If we're not talking about the truth, how are we ever going to get to reconciliation? What I see Canadians often wanting to do is jump from, nothing to reconciliation, but we haven't talked about the truth. And today I'm wearing my medicine wheel. So as Algonquin people, this is the colors that we use. And we would say you have to be balanced in all four directions. You need to be balanced physically, spiritually, emotionally, and mentally. And when one of those comes out of balance, you're supposed to go take the time to bring it back in balance. We're sitting here talking on Zoom, and that's not physical. So we're not physically active. So what are we going to do to counterbalance that? We're talking, we're using our mental abilities and some emotional abilities, but we didn't smudge. We didn't use any spirituality in today's conversation. So again, it's just trying to bring balance in everything you do. We can't pretend like our world is perfect. I know I keep saying that, but it's really about our humanity. We've forgotten about how to be human. And we've forgotten how to interact with people. I was talking to somebody else recently, and I said, before we would have thought nothing of, we knew a family down the street that was maybe struggling with the pandemic. They didn't have money. We would have taken them food. Where are people doing that right now? Or are they just going to food banks and dropping off some cans? Like, it's more personable if I come to you as a person and try to help out. And this is the piece I think we really need to start talking about, is how do we get back to that humanity? That's what Canadians were always known for, right? We were always known for helping out our neighbors, for doing stuff in a community or a neighborhood. And now it seems like that's almost gone. And I feel like if we started to have those conversations, my neighbors all know that I'm Indigenous. They often ask me strange questions about in being Indigenous and indigeneity. So I'm just thinking, can you imagine if we actually had conversations where it wasn't racist or microaggression remarks, but rather true conversations so that we could get to know each other? We got forced into many different federal policies where it seems like Indigenous people should be separated from everybody else, including reserves in the Indian Act. But really, it's about having conversations, true and authentic conversations where we're building friendships and relationships. And we aren't going to be able to survive as humans if we don't start having these conversations, let alone that we're not having conversations about what's wrong in our world. People get very antsy when you talk about politics. People get very antsy when you talk about education or healthcare. I always have the good topics, right? Talking about these always make people want to talk. These are the topics that are always first and foremost on everybody's agenda.
The only reason that we're going to stop talking now is because I have another interview to do. Next time Sarah and I already know. Next time you're coming on the show, Doc, you're here for like 6 hours, so just buckle up. And maybe, I'm not trying to be, I say this in absolute sincerity. Maybe we could find some way to do a smudge or something. Maybe we could, I'm really, I hosted an event pre-pandemic, as a matter of fact, just days before, the very beginning of March of 2020. And it was the Alberta Emergency Management Summit. So you have these emergency managers from different communities and all these types of things, and fire chiefs and elected officials and Indigenous leaders were in the room as well. And I was privy to, at the very opening of the conference, a smudge and a pipe ceremony, and with very limited understanding of the cultural significance, but an openness to it. I can tell you, and I see people on our live chat right now talking about some of the vigils that they've attended relating to the Kamloops discovery, talking about the smell of sweetgrass, even non-Indigenous people talking about the calming effect. You have some right there with you. There you go. The calming effect that it has. And there is this real power, to bring it back to my experience there, the privilege of being involved in that ceremony. It does something to you, even if you don't understand.
Yes.
You sort of attend and you're there, sort of in prayer in a sense. In other words, I make myself available mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, physically as well, of course. And it does something. And I think that there is a real power there, if for no other reason that you are gathering in community and respecting tradition, and it's big.
And you're pulling your mind. So part of smudging, I'm not the elder, but I'm going to try to give you a little synopsis, but smudging allows you to bring all your minds together, bring all your hearts together. And part of why you do that is to cleanse yourself. So I'm just looking over my smudge kits beside me. It's to cleanse your eyes so I see you in a good way. It's to cleanse my mouth so I'm speaking in a good way. I cleanse my ears so I can hear you in a good way. I cleanse my brain so I'm thinking in a good way. And I cleanse my heart so I'm talking in a good way. So when I say that, while that sounds like some, New Ager kind of idea, it's the idea that we're trying to bring ourselves together in a way that we're synergizing our energies. That's what the elders always tell us. We need to synergize. We need to connect on multiple levels. We can't fix the world's problems with old world thinking, which is Albert Einstein's, phrase. So the only way we're going to fix the problems we have in Canada right now is when we start to think in a new way.
Doctor, how do you pronounce your community? Is it Timiskaming? Is that how you say it?
Timiskaming.
Timiskaming, the Timiskaming First Nation. Dr. Angela Mashford-Pringle, out of the Indigenous, or the Institute rather, for Indigenous Health. I'm just going to rattle off your CV here. I don't care if it makes you uncomfortable, Doc. You got to sit through this. The Associate Director, Professor at the Waakebiness-Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health at the Dalalana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, Director of the Masters of Public Health Indigenous Health Program, Director of the Collaborative Specialization in Indigenous Health, founding editor of the Turtle Island Journal on Indigenous Health, and obviously a compelling speaker. I don't know if you have our live chat going beside you. I assume not, because you've seemed rather focused, and it pulls my focus away every time I dip in. But let me just say, people en masse are indicating their gratitude for what you've brought to the table today. Thank you for this, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Chi Miigwech.
You bet. Dr. Angela Mashford-Pringle, some random guy in the live chat says, you got to stop promising 6-hour interviews with literally everybody you talk to. I will not stop making those promises. I will not apologize for compelling interviews on the show.
Well, I have definitely made a note how she has that new research that she's planning.
Yeah.
So we'll definitely have to have her back.
Yeah, absolutely. You're sort of like, I'm trying to think, I don't know enough baseball to really come up with the, I was going to say this is like Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire 15 years ago, but people would probably read too much into like the cream and the clear and the steroid allegation, which is not what I mean. But
are you talking about my amazing biceps?
I'm talking about,
That's what you're talking about,
close.
Right? Look at these.
Close.
Look at the.
But I'm talking about the bookings. It's like back-to-back jacks, as they say. So a great job by Sarah Hoyles, getting the voices that matter as part of these conversations. I wanted to read this email that we received from G. Before we move on, we're going to talk about El Salvador and Bitcoin and all that stuff that's going on. But a great email from G, the subject line 215. And I'm going to get to that in just a minute. First, I want to remind you that we receive our emails on MacBook Pros. We read our tweets on iMacs. I get my mentions on the show on the iPhone, and Sam's running the whole thing on the iMac. The studio is powered by Westworld Computers. They'd love to power your startup too, whether it's at home, whether it's in the office. They have the solution, and their team of customer service experts plus their team, of course, of technicians able to answer whatever challenge you may have. They've been doing it for more than 40 years, family owned. They can do it all online as well, shipping anywhere via westworld.ca. We check our hashtag RealTalkRJ, powered by the team at Park Power. At parkpower.ca, if you use the promo code 2021-RealTalk, you know by now, I tell you every single day, $70 off your first bill. But I guarantee, I know that there's going to be somebody today you're going to act today. Today's the day you're going to go, why have I just been leaving $70 pinned up to the bulletin board? Why have I not walked up and taken that $70? Why not take your business to Park Power? You can do it again, the promo code 2021-RealTalk. And a big shout out to the team at Sherwood and St. Albert Dodge. I'm hitting the road this weekend in my Jeep, and I know I'm not alone. The lineup from the little puddle jumpers, like we call them, the grocery getters, the good fuel-efficient city rigs. Jeep's got that all the way up to the big brands, that Grand Wagoneer on its way back, going toe-to-toe against all the big luxury SUVs everybody likes to talk about. I like to think that Lincoln Navigator sales are about to plunge when the Jeep Grand Wagoneers start showing up on the lots at St. Albert and Sherwood Dodge. You can check out their inventory online. Just follow the sponsors tab at ryanjesperson.com. Talk at ryanjesperson.com is where you can send us an email. G says, I just want to say I really appreciate conversations you've been having around issues pertinent to Indigenous peoples on Real Talk, even before the discovery of the 215 babies. Why do I appreciate the conversation? In part, says G, because I'm First Nations. I have the luck of being a white appearing treaty Indian in this fair country of ours. My own upbringing was not on a reserve. Our family moved to a different province, so we only visited our reserve to see family, but I have very fond memories of going home. I've always been vocal, and have never shied away from talking about my family. I didn't grow up blind to the history of residential schools because my mom and her siblings went to residential school. It was known that kids died in these places. It was known that there were kids that were not accounted for. But knowing doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, right? Ryan, you spoke of walking through a cemetery last weekend in tears. I too had tears. I had tears as I laid shoes that belonged to my daughter at the base of the Catholic statue at the legislature grounds. I brought a teddy bear of hers as well, and I tucked sage into her shoes, and I cried as I watched a young girl named Meadow dance in her jingle dress in front of that statue. G says you should go to the Facebook page Smudge the Blades and watch Meadow dance. She is what should never have been taken away. She is the representation of the spirits of babies that were not allowed to be held by their families as they left the world and then were hidden away. I'm glad these children have been found. We all need to have these tough conversations. It's good to talk about this and to be honest. You know that there are things that people can't talk about. Residential school is something my mother's generation has an incredibly difficult time talking about. My siblings, cousins, and I have said many times that it will likely, as a matter of fact, require the death of the older generation for our family to be able to openly discuss the trauma. There's anger and there's hurt if we are discovered to be talking about this history by our family members. The trauma's too deep. So we wait, holding our breath, snatching small moments of truth, tucking that truth away to remember and to learn from it. Imagine not being able to speak with your family about such a large part of your history, because this isn't just, the one family member who has PTSD from the war that they fought in. This is every person who attended these schools, in my case, with my family. So you think, well, hey, I could probably go on some ancestry website and learn, except no, because people are missing. There are missing names. And even the records that were kept are hard to find. They're missing information. They were poorly handled. Very few photographs. We still live via spoken history, except the people that hold it will not speak. This year is the cutoff for people who went to Indian day schools to apply for compensation. That's a whole other conversation, says G. And the supports aren't there for people filling out the forms. At least with residential schools, there were more supports for people struggling to fill out the paperwork. So again, many people struggle as they relive trauma and write it into small boxes, not to get a payout, but to hold people accountable for what happened. I hope that you keep having these conversations. They're more important than you know. Because at times, you're not just educating settlers, you're providing opportunities for people like me to have conversations that are denied to me. G says, I'd also like to extend a personal invitation to attend a blanket exercise when we're allowed to conduct them again. Says, I work with a great group of youth that do it well, and it's very impactful. There's nothing like doing a blanket exercise with a group of teens and adults to see it in full generational light. G says, thanks for providing a space for real talk. Well, save me a spot at the blanket ceremony, and I'll be there. You can send us your email anytime to talk@ryanjesperson.com, and we so appreciate the powerful emails that we've received. Let's take a look at a story that's been making news internationally when it comes to currencies. When it comes to official currencies, this is described as a milestone in monetary history. You can check out Forbes.com for the piece on the significance of what's just occurred in El Salvador. It's written by Avik from the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, also a policy editor at Forbes. Also joining us for a conversation on this, the founder and CEO of our presenting sponsor, Bitcoin Well, Adam O'Brien. It's great to have you both here. Looking forward to this conversation. Avik, making your debut on the show, welcome. We're thrilled to have you. Why don't you sum this up for us? I mean, you literally wrote the piece on it in a tiny little publication called Forbes that people may have heard about. Why is this so significant, what went down in El Salvador?
Well, first, let me say, as a guy who grew up north of Windsor in suburban Detroit, watching Channel 9, Hockey Night in Canada when the Wings and the Leafs play, it's always a pleasure to be on Canadian media. Well, in terms of this particular story, look, I think this is one of the most important developments in recent memory when it comes to financial history and the global financial system. This is incredibly important because for the last 50 years, we've been living under this system where currencies float against each other in what you might call a market-based system. There's no gold standard, right? We left the gold standard. The world left the gold standard after the end of Bretton Woods. Nixon ended it in 1971. Now you have a country, the smallest country in North America, actually, saying, look, we are going to create a system in which the U.S. dollar is competing against a 21st century monetary network in which the value of all the Bitcoins in the world, or the number of circulating Bitcoins in the world, is fixed. And so there's no unelected bureaucracy like the Federal Reserve that can just magically increase the supply of U.S. dollars by 30% in 12 months like the Fed just did. That is an incredible development. And really what it shows, and what I wrote about in the most recent piece, is that disruptive innovation starts in low-income countries. It starts with low-margin product. It starts humbly, much in the way that Toyota and Honda, started with small compact cars, brought those into the U.S. and took on Detroit, where Detroit didn't care. Detroit didn't care if they lost on compact cars because they were still selling trucks and SUVs and luxury cars. And all of a sudden, the Japanese figured out how to beat them on that too. Right, and here's something that may happen with monetary policy. If El Salvador figures out how to make Bitcoin work for the 70% of Salvadorans who don't even have bank accounts, then it's going to work everywhere.
Adam, you're in the business of Bitcoin. I know that this is a story that obviously you've been paying keen attention to. From your perspective, why is this so significant?
Yeah, I mean, this might make for boring media. I think Avik and I are going to agree on a lot of things. I think that, the key is calling it a milestone, which I think insinuates this is not the end. This is not kind of the final chapter for Bitcoin. This is the start. At Bitcoin 2021, where this was announced, people were calling this kind of the first pitch of the first inning for Bitcoin. And I tend to agree with that. I think that, we're in the business of making Bitcoin accessible and making Bitcoin usable. And here we are in El Salvador, and the government is making it law that you have to make Bitcoin usable, that you have to make Bitcoin accessible. Elon Musk is maybe eating a little bit of crow right now because he has to sell Teslas for Bitcoin in El Salvador. It's remarkable to see a government taking this monetary policy that is so sound and incapable of being corrupt into its monetary cycle. And I think that's really important and an obvious win for Bitcoin.
Let me, Avik, I'm curious for your take on this. Sam, I want to share my screen here just so people can see it. So this gives people a sense of what it's been a tumultuous month or so. It's been a very interesting 2021 for crypto, Bitcoin in particular. Right now, valued at about, let's call it about 40,475 Canadian right now. A lot of people, I think, right now are using the word unstable or unpredictable. I don't know if any currency is predictable, but the instability here. Yet, Avik, I've heard a lot of people suggest that this move could bring some stability to El Salvador's bottom line, or to the reality there, the economic reality. Do you buy that, and can you help us sort out or make sense of that?
Yeah, so first of all, before I started doing what I do now, I actually spent 12 years as a fund manager in New York and Boston. So I spent a lot of time thinking about volatility, returns, and things like that. And look, Bitcoin's only 12 years old. So you don't go from a $0 asset to $1 trillion asset in market value without some volatility along the way, right? It doesn't just go up $1 a day, right? It's going to go up and down. But here's the thing, usually people talk about the tumult and the volatility as a negative thing. Oh gosh, got to stay away from Bitcoin. It's too volatile. But here's the thing, if you actually calculate what's called a Sharpe ratio, which is the risk-adjusted return, meaning how much has Bitcoin gone up relative to its volatility, it outperforms every single major stock index in the world. The TSX, the S&P 500, pick your poison. Bitcoin on a volatility adjusted basis has outperformed every single one of those asset classes. So from an investment standpoint, at least over the past 12 years, Bitcoin has been a better investment despite the volatility than conventional asset classes. Now, here's the thing that El Salvador is doing to take into account. Like, look, if you're running a business, if you're running a grocery store or a bodega on the street corner, and you're transacting in both US dollars and Bitcoin, and the value of those two currencies is changing all the time, that's kind of complicated for you, right? So the government is setting up this back-end infrastructure so that if you don't like the volatility of Bitcoin, you can have all those purchases or sales in Bitcoin instantly converted to dollars at the market price, and then you don't have to think about it anymore. It's just basically a back-end easy way to transact the money. On the other hand, if you do want to park some of your profits or your savings into Bitcoin to take advantage of those risk-adjusted returns over time, you now have the option to do that, and you will not pay capital gains on those returns relative to the US dollar, because Bitcoin is legal tender, an official national currency of El Salvador. As the president said last night, 1 BTC is 1 BTC.
Let's take. It's been fascinating. I want to talk to you both about the president just like dropping in on Twitter Spaces and doing interviews, and like it was just it's been a wild few days. Here's one of the tweets that we were keeping an eye on. It's just been really an interesting story to follow, and you can see here just the conversations. We had sort of El Salvador's president has been tweeting about it, and we'll get to some of the different messages there. You can see here, I've just sent the Bitcoin law to Congress. People are looking at this and like, is that a verified account? Is this real? People are trying to make, and then all of a sudden the president's showing up and he's doing interviews, and people are going, just with like, not just with, because I'm probably in the same boat, but like just with, digital media platforms, people that are like, he's not talking to the Wall Street Journal. He's not talking to the New York Times. And people are going, this is like, when you talk about the word disruption, when you use the word disruption, I think it's being overused. I think a lot of people perceive themselves to be disruptors when really they're not. They're purveyors of the status quo. This certainly qualifies. Adam, what has this done from your perspective when it comes to some of the conversations that you may be having with naysayers, with people within the industry? What has this done? Well, maybe I should use the word to Bitcoin's credibility, or do you think to the credibility of the bigger conversation around crypto, this has to be a mile marker? Yeah,
big time. I think, it's very poetic that a commodity or a cryptocurrency made for the people is, and the president is using direct to consumer or those types of communications platforms without the kind of middleman. I think it's kind of showing where the world is going. As far as the credibility to Bitcoin, it's a no-brainer. I think if you talked about it in 2014, people would say, well, only criminals use Bitcoin. And then in 2016, it was, well, only a small section of geeks use Bitcoin. And then in 2018, it was, well, really only a small number of people in very select countries use Bitcoin. And now the conversation is, well, only small countries use Bitcoin. And so I'm very excited to see what happens in 2023, 2025, who the only people are using Bitcoin. So certainly the credibility is massive. I think it's telling too that El Salvador, just like Michael Saylor at MicroStrategies, this narrative that central banks cannot be trusted with money printing. The monetary policy within central banks is garbage, and I think that Bitcoin fixes that. And I think that the way Bitcoin is catching on with these massive headlines is very telling of that.
Avik, would you agree with that? What Adam just said about the lack of credibility or some mistrust around central banks and Bitcoin being the answer to that?
Well, what I would say is that there's this kind of paradox of human nature, which is that at the precise moment where you think you're on top of the world and you can do no wrong and anything you do is going to work is when you mess up. And I think that's the case with the U.S. Federal Reserve. The U.S. Federal Reserve has dined out on now a $28 trillion public debt in the United States, being able to increase the money supply without anyone really punishing the U.S. for it, because there has been for so long, so many decades, no real alternative to the U.S. dollar. If you're a $3 trillion financial institution or you're a sovereign government, you got to park your money somewhere. You're going to park it in U.S. dollars in the form of treasury bonds, because there's nothing else more liquid that you can buy to just park your money if you've got that kind of money sloshing around. Now you have this new asset emerging that over time may be competitive with the U.S. dollar as a store of value, as a liquid store of value. And it's at that moment where you're kind of starting to see those curves intersect, where the Fed says, well, we can increase the monetary supply by 30% and no one's going to care because, hey, who stopped us thus far? And all of a sudden, people are saying, well, wait a minute, we now have an alternative place to park our money because we don't trust you. And that's how the ball starts going in the other direction.
So, Avik, let me ask you about your newest piece here. Forbes.com is where people can read it. El Salvador enacts Bitcoin law, ushering in new era of global monetary inclusion. Let me give you the caveat, or I'll impose one rule here. You can't say everybody. The question is, who's paying close attention to this? Is President Joe Biden? Is the U.S. Treasury? Who's paying very close attention? I don't want to call it an experiment, but who's paying attention to El Salvador?
Well, first of all, I think in terms of just what the visibility of this is, it's got the fact that the law passed got a lot of visibility. I think in all the financial news sources in the United States, the Wall Street Journal, CNBC, those kinds of venues, Bloomberg, this was pretty well covered. So I think anyone who follows financial and economic news knows about this in the United States. Certainly, people in regulatory bodies like the Federal Reserve, like the International Monetary Fund, those people are also paying attention because this really directly affects macroeconomic and monetary policy. So people in that kind of corner of the world are definitely interested. Financial markets are definitely interested. And you're seeing, look at all the top hedge fund managers in the U.S. over the last 12 months who've come out and said, you know what? If I look at all the tools I have to protect my fund and my investors against inflation, Bitcoin's at the top of the list in terms of undervalued tools to protect my partners against inflation. So you're seeing more and more people aware of that, and we're starting to see the inflation news get worse around the world and in the United States. So I think you're starting to see a lot more of this. And again, it's kind of a snowball effect. We have this $28 trillion debt. Joe Biden is proposing $6 trillion more of spending that will be paid for in who knows how exactly ways. And so these kinds of things accelerate the mistrust, because if you print all this debt in terms of issuing treasury bonds and other governments say, hey, we know you're broke, United States. Why should we buy this debt? It's kind of like when you're running your credit card and you can't really pay the bills and the bank pulls your credit card. Basically, that's kind of what's happening to the treasury bond. The demand internationally for treasury bonds is declining, and demand for Bitcoin is increasing. And that's a trickle effect now, but over time, it could be a much more significant effect. And this El Salvador news does so much to transform the institutional resilience of Bitcoin. That's why it's such a significant piece of news.
Adam, I know that you appreciate, Adam, you ask for the tough questions from audience members. There's one here from Whiterium says, so hang on a second. So you're a business and you've just accepted Bitcoin as payment for a product, but the next day Bitcoin falls and now you've lost money on the transaction. Currencies need to be stable. Bitcoin is not that. What would you say to Whiterium?
Yeah, that's a I think that's a fair point. I think that, my answer is kind of twofold. So one, there are tools out there. So the announcer of this project in El Salvador is called Jack Mallers, and Jack owns a company called Strike. He's the one working with El Salvador and has created the tools to eliminate the volatility in the same way that Avik was just talking about. Bitcoin becomes a Visa or a MasterCard type of payment rail, where Bitcoin gets sent to the merchant. Immediately, that Bitcoin is converted into US dollars, and the merchant receives US dollars. So right then and there, the volatility risk is virtually nullified because you're converting it in real time. Second to that, though, I would not call our existing currency stable. We don't see the massive jumps and spikes like we do in Bitcoin because we don't compare the Canadian dollar or the US dollar to anything other than the Canadian or the US dollar. But if you look at inflation over time, if you look at the way prices are increasing like crazy right now, it's not because assets are getting more valuable. I mean, you look at the housing market's on fire, the lumber market's on fire, the oil market's on fire, everything, prices are increasing, not because things are getting more valuable, but because the money that we used to buy those things is getting less valuable. In my experience, I've only been on this earth for 28 short years, but I've never seen prices go down, which makes me think, I think this is inflation, and this might be the start of kind of a hyperinflationary state. So I wouldn't necessarily call our existing monetary system stable.
Let me add something to that because we've been talking a lot about the volatility, but one thing to remember is that the U.S. dollar and the Canadian dollar and currencies like those currencies, mainstream, large country, advanced industrialized currencies, they're guaranteed to lose value over time under the current monetary system we have because of inflation, right? So if you actually look at a chart of what a Canadian dollar or U.S. dollar buys in terms of groceries, that it's a straight line down over the last 70, 80, 90 years, right? The analogy that Michael Saylor uses is the melting ice cube. Maybe in certain parts of Canada, ice doesn't melt, so maybe Canadians don't understand this analogy. But in the U.S., ice cubes melt, and over time, that ice cube of your savings is guaranteed to go down. If you have $100 in the bank over a 30-year period, you're guaranteed to lose 60% of the value of that U.S. dollar, even at 2% inflation, right? So that's a guaranteed loser. And so the question is, yes, there's volatility, but would you rather go with something that's almost guaranteed to go up over the very long term in value, or something that's guaranteed to go down over the long term in value?
Okay, so we'll close by, I want to ask the two of you to make a prediction. Because Adam, you've been on before. We've had conversations about pushback from big banks, about, I won't say threats, but let me say indications of concern from significant political leadership in some pretty big countries, I know, including the President of the United States. Do the two of you think that Bitcoin would ever be adopted, ever, as an official currency in Canada and or the United States? Adam, what do you think?
I think it's inevitable if Canada and or the United States wants to remain relevant. I think that we are seeing Bitcoin do what Bitcoin does best, which is create a free and open market. I think El Salvador is the first of many small and hopeful countries that are looking for alternative ways to gain wealth and achieve sovereignty. And I think that adding Bitcoin to the balance sheet, adding Bitcoin as tender is making governments look at that and think, how am I going to remain competitive when countries are so forward thinking and adopting this incredible monetary policy such as Bitcoin? So I would say I'm hopeful that yes, but if not, I think that will be to the peril of Canada and the United States.
Avik, what do you think?
Yeah, I think over the very long term, moving to a more traditional hard currency type standard is going to have to happen if these countries want to be competitive with the Bitcoin standard. But I will say it doesn't have to be Bitcoin specifically, right? You could have an Indigenous standard where you say this is the fixed number of dollars that we're going to issue, and we're going to cap that, and we're going to promise that somehow, and move in that way. And maybe you get enough of the way there that people are okay with that. But certainly moving to a Bitcoin standard would be the most, I think that would be the simplest thing to do. I just think it's going to be hard for the U.S. to accept that the U.S. dollar is not supreme. So the question for the U.S. and for Canada is, Do we only adopt a Bitcoin standard after a massive economic and monetary and fiscal dislocation in our countries, where we have real crises where a lot of people are hurt? Or do we tack into the wind and actually go in the direction that we should be going and gradually move ourselves into a sounder money posture so that the transition to a Bitcoin-based monetary policy is smoother for our people and for our economies? That's the question in front of policymakers today. And we all have to do our part to hope that to encourage policymakers to make that choice.
Avik is a policy editor at Forbes, joining us from the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Adam O'Brien, the founder and CEO of Bitcoin Well. Appreciate your perspectives on this, fellas. Thanks for making time for us.
Thanks so much.
You can let me know what you think about this. I know that we've got audience members like Hounds are watching. Hounds say this was an absolutely monumental moment for Bitcoin, and then he has like the head exploding emoji. And then we've got some people that are absolutely adamantly against the entire concept or premise or existence of Bitcoin or any type of crypto. And I see some assertive comments being made on the live chat, which is great. We encourage your feedback. We understand that not every. Can you imagine if I was doing interviews that would only cover ground where everybody would agree on absolutely every single thing? This would be the most boring talk show of all time. But what we cannot ignore, I saw one audience member say, hey, I understand Ryan needs to pay the bills. I understand there needs to be paid content. A nation, a country just voted to adopt cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, as official legal tender, as a legal currency. That is a story. Some people believe that crypto will be more relevant than what other people believe that it may be, and that's perfectly fine, and only time will tell. I'm fascinated by it. I'm very intrigued by it. I still approach from a very limited understanding of how it will apply and what it will look like, and I'm wide open to your feedback on why you back it, why you invest in it, why you think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, or why you think it's, to quote POTUS one more time, malarkey. Talk at ryanjesperson.com is where you can send us your emails. Do not ever hold back on our live chat. Not that you would. I know you wouldn't, but we want to hear from you no matter what. Thanks to everybody, our engaged listeners. We really appreciate it. The team at Kubi Energy wants us to remind you that their teams right now are working across Western Canada on residential, commercial, and industrial applications, helping people and businesses, some of them nonprofits, achieve their sustainability goals with solar panel installs. They're Tesla certified. They've got electricians and electrical apprentices doing all the installs, plus their team handles all the paperwork. What could be easier than that? It all starts with a visit to kubienergy.ca, or if you're already on our website, ryanjesperson.com, just click over to the sponsors tab. That's where you'll find them. And don't forget to send us your emails, your positive reflections. We're taking Monday off, by the way. The show's taking Monday off. We're giving the team a long weekend, which means that Tuesday morning of next week, Kubi will present Positive Reflections. Coming up tomorrow, of course, we'll present Trash Talk. That's from the team at Local Waste. They proudly present it to wrap up our broadcast week each and every week. Your chance to get a little something off your chest. I've been telling you, unless somebody rolls in and knocks off this email, we already have our finishing email. We already have our finishing move for tomorrow. It's from Wade. I'm not going to read it yet. I hold it right now in my hand, this trash talk from Wade. I almost want to read it now and then read it again tomorrow, but I don't think it needs the double whammy. I think that it's going to be the step up. It's going to be the walk-off home run that Wade hits tomorrow. Really looking forward to that. There's no BS at Local Waste. As a matter of fact, one of their corporate principles, it's literally up on the wall. It says no BS, and that's why they're sounding the alarm right now. If you're an entrepreneur in Edmonton, you may have got an email from a waste services provider that, it sort of appears like they might be sort of trying to dupe people, to dupe them into contract extensions based on some flimsy logic. I talked to the team at Local Waste about it. They said, you should let Real Talkers know. I said, oh, I will. So if you've got a suspicious email, you entrepreneurs, about your waste contracts, give the team at Local Waste a call. They'll cut through the BS for you and help you sort out a solution that works best for your small business. Again, at localwaste.ca. Our friends at Athabasca University present Power Ed. And if you go to powered.ca right now, you're going to see how you can learn, how you can better yourself, how you can get updated on demand, online, taking fabulous courses, learning new skill sets in a structure that fits your schedule. Everything from allyship and inclusion to digital wellness. What about learning more about AI and machine learning? What about powering your employees or powering your organization, making sure your skill sets are future-proof? You can learn more at powered.ca, proudly presented by Athabasca University. And of course, before we get to some of the comments that you've been making here, I also wanted to remind you that the team at Campers Village, they're brand new as builders here at Real Talk, and we're really excited what they're bringing to the mix because we've got shared values about the value of getting outdoors. They've got more than just camping gear, whether you're looking for great clothing, more lifestyle clothing for on and off the trails, travel gear, clothing, luggage, even useful outdoor gear for backcountry exploration, the front country car camping, or even the cabin, lake, or backyard life. At campers-village.com, they've got you covered. Plus, there are 2 stores in Edmonton, 1 store in Calgary, and a note that most orders over $49 ship for free across the country. If you're looking to upgrade your gear and get outside, visit our friends at campers-village.com. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've been talking about healthcare for Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. We've been taking a look at El Salvador, and we've been taking a look at what's going on with currency, and of course, out of the gates today, we get the Jewish perspective on violence in the Middle East and ultimately what moving forward looks like in the pursuit of a 2-state solution, if indeed that is the solution. We've appreciated the feedback that you've brought to us, but we haven't spent a ton of time talking about the attacks, the sustained attacks on Alberta's premier. I haven't even checked in with our team yet. We haven't really got into it, but it's a story that we really can't ignore. Yesterday, Alberta's premier, I suppose, confirming what TC Energy had been hinting at for a while, which was that the Keystone XL pipeline is indeed done. It's going to cost the people of Alberta $1.3 billion, and it's certainly raising the ire of, I think, conservative supporters that feel like it was a move that maybe didn't best fit Alberta's circumstance, and most certainly those that would oppose the government. We're going to continue conversations on that tomorrow. We're going to be keeping an eye on our inbox today to see what you have to say about it. We'll continue to explore those stories. When we get into it tomorrow, that's exactly going to be the subject matter for our Friday roundtable. You know, our Real Talk roundtable goes every Friday live at 9 a.m. Mountain, 11 o'clock Eastern. We'll talk about investment in pipelines, and then we'll talk about investment in hydrogen, Canada, and Alberta's energy future. A deep dive with an all-star panel. We look forward to you joining us then. In the meantime, make it a great Thursday. Thanks for making Real Talk part of your day. We'll speak to you soon.